introduce John Esterly as our new executive director and give him a chance to talk about some of his background and his what he's been doing as his day job. And then he'll get in and talk a little bit about the Midwest Interstate Passenger Rail Commission. So, John, I will turn it over to you.
Well, thank you, Brian. Good morning, everyone. Appreciate you folks being here on a Saturday morning. I don't know what it's like in other parts of the state, but it's kind of a dreary Saturday here in Columbus. It's been raining pretty regularly since I got up this morning. So again, I am John Esterly. I am absolutely delighted to be the new executive director of All Aboard Ohio. I've been a member for a while now, been on the board for almost a year at this point, and we were able to kind of get the I's dotted and T's crossed over the past few weeks to make things official. So very excited to be in this role. I am by trade a locomotive engineer, so I am the one of the folks driving the trains around Ohio. But really more of my time is spent as an elected union official. I am the state legislative director for the Brotherhood of Locomotive Engineers and Trainmen. So spend much of my time working on advocacy for things like rail safety, for the improvement of regulation, and then where a lot of the overlap comes in is for the expansion of passenger rail. So career railroader, I've got, nearly 14 years of experience on the railroad now. Been in a union leadership role for just over a decade at this point. And again, very excited to be working with All Aboard Ohio in a more formal role. So I did want to talk today. We've heard a lot about the Midwest Interstate Passenger Rail Commission and efforts for Ohio to get back involved. And we've come to realize that not everybody might know what that is. So we wanted to spend some time talking about what the commission is, what it does, and then talk specifically about efforts to rejoin in Ohio, and then what folks like you can do in terms of advocacy to make sure that we're able to, to become a part of this commission again. So what is the MIPRC? So this is straight off their website. I won't read it to you, but we've had this organization for nearly a quarter of a century now. They work to promote expanded passenger rail throughout the Midwest region, which is a 12-state area that we'll discuss a little bit later on. They work as kind of an intermediary between state and local governments and the federal government. So probably the most important role that MIPRC serves is as the administrating body for what's called the Midwest Passenger Rail Plan, which is one of the Federal Railroad Administration's planning documents. So they're the ones that kind of act as the conduit to make sure that these, this plan is carried out, and they make a lot of the determinations about how it's carried out. So MIPRC, we've got a number of states that are already part of the commission. Most notably, there are 4 that are not, that are part of the region, and I've got Ohio highlighted here. Ohio is kind of unique in the states that are not included because it's really the one that acts as the kind of the intermediary state between the Midwest and kind of the East Coast. So the fact that we don't have a seat at the table really does impact us pretty greatly. Iowa, Nebraska, and South Dakota, while they do have passenger rail service in some places, they're not necessarily as exposed as Ohio is to decisions that are being made. So there are a number of partners that they also have in the Midwest Interstate Passenger Rail Commission. I've got one highlighted here that is probably the most notable for us, which is the Ohio Association of Regional Councils. That particular organization is the kind of collective voice of the planning organizations that Brian was talking about earlier. So places like NOACA, like TMCOG, like MIPRC here in Columbus, OKI in Cincinnati. So these kind of regional councils that are making executive decisions. They've got a collective group that is part of the MIPRC, but unfortunately, they are not a voting partner. So we do have, kind of an informational connection, but not really any kind of a structural connection. So what are the purposes of MIPRC? So again, kind of straight off of their website, we want to promote current improvements and long-range plans for intercity passenger rail service in the Midwest. This aligns very, very well with All Aboard Ohio's strategic vision. They act again as the conduit between state officials and the federal government. They also support efforts of DOTs such as ours here at ODOT in developing and implementing passenger rail service, which is another critical reason why we need to get back on. Unfortunately, our DOT really doesn't have the infrastructure to plan passenger rail service because it's just something they've never done before. So MIPRC will certainly act as an advisory organization to help our folks, get back on track, as it were. And then again, as of October 2021, they are the administrator of the Midwest Regional Rail Plan, which talks a lot about potential expansion for passenger rail throughout the Midwest region. I did want to share this image with you. This is a little dated because this is from 2021, which is obviously prior to the Corridor ID program announcement and the more recent FRA long distance study announcement. But this gives you kind of an idea of FRA and MIPRC's vision for what connectivity will look like in the Midwest area. Again, this is a 40-year conceptual vision, so we're looking forward to 2055 here. This isn't necessarily something that's going to happen overnight. So why is MIPRC important? I kind of hinted at it, but without a seat at the table, there are decisions being made about operations in Ohio, and that's being done without our input. So, Brian talked about the Southwest chapter's trips to Chicago and back that happened in the middle of the night. A lot of the reason that these trips happen in the middle of the night is because we don't have the opportunity to say, hey, we would be interested in daylight service in Ohio, which is, a huge hindrance to us. And then also when we look forward at our state-sponsored rail corridors, things like 3CD, like Cleveland, Toledo, Detroit, like MIPRC's Midwest Connect, we want to make sure that the interaction between those state-sponsored corridors and the existing and potentially new long-distance routes happens seamlessly. The example I get is if I were to take a train from Columbus to Cleveland with my end destination being, a point east like New York City, it really does us no good to have me stay in the city of Cleveland for a day or more waiting on the next eastbound train. So, really being able to structure our schedule and have it match up very well with the long distance schedule is going to be critical to the overall success of these state-sponsored routes. So I've mentioned that we are not part of the MIPRC, but that may change soon. So a bill was introduced in Ohio's legislature very, very recently in the middle of April to rejoin MIPRC and to appoint commissioners to that board. It is bipartisan in nature. You can see the primary sponsors here, Rep. Gambari from the Toledo area and Rep. Skindle from the Cleveland area, who are both outspoken advocates of passenger rail. Those of you who have been with All Aboard Ohio for several years may remember that Rep. Gambari addressed us virtually at our statewide meeting 2 years ago. And there is work to get a Senate companion bill. So you would see a Senate bill and then a 3-digit number after it that would run at the same time as this House bill. We'll talk a little bit about why that's important in a slide or two. So the analysis of House Bill 488, this is really at a high level what it does. We're going to adopt the Midwest Interstate Passenger Rail Compact, which we were a part of from 2002 until we withdrew in 2013. As part of that compact, we're going to appoint members to the MIPRC. There will be a total of 4 commissioners that are appointed, the governor or a representative from his office or their office. somebody who represents the private sector, and then one member of each of the chambers of our legislature. So we will have someone from the House and someone from the Senate. There's really no stipulation as to party affiliation, so we could end up with 2 Democrats, 2 Republicans, or 1 of each. So yeah, a total of 4 folks will go to the MIPRC to represent Ohio. It also kind of talks about the duties of these commissioners and what they will, what they will do to represent Ohio. And then finally, there's some language in there about how we get in, how we get out, and where the money comes from. As kind of a high-level summary, the money will come from the ORDC operating budget. For the short term, we will just assign some general revenue funds over to help cover this. It's a fairly minimal fee for the annual fee, but then ideally, as we arrive at our next transportation budget and subsequent transportation budgets, we'll just have the funding assigned right out of those budgets. So, for those of you that don't do what I do and maybe aren't as familiar with the way that our legislative process here works, this is kind of a high-level overview of how the process works. So we've got a bill right now that was introduced in the House. It has been assigned to a House committee. We'll have hearings in that committee. We'll have the sponsors come in and talk about why it's important. Then we'll have folks that are in favor come in and offer what's called proponent testimony. We'll have folks that are opposed come in and offer what's called opponent testimony. And then the committee will vote on that bill. Once the committee has voted to report either favorably or not favorably, it'll go to the House floor and then eventually go on to the governor. Now, if a bill is only run in one chamber or the other, so say House Bill 488 goes all the way through the House, but there isn't a Senate companion bill, then we would have to go back to the Senate and kind of start over with the same language. So you would see, in this case, House Bill 488 introduced in the Senate. That does kind of slow the process down because you kind of have to go through all 4 steps again, and you're not doing it at the same time. So that's why there's a push to have a what's called a companion bill started in the Senate so that this process can kind of play itself out in both chambers at the same time. If the same language is passed by both chambers, then it is just sent to the governor for a signature. So at this point, House Bill 488 has been introduced. It has been assigned to committee. It has been assigned to the Economic and Workforce Development Committee. Representative DJ Swearingen is the chair of that committee. He is kind of the northwest corner of the state. And we've got a lot of friends of passenger rail that are on that committee as well. So just looking at it again from a high level, I'm pretty confident that we're going to get a fair shake in that committee and hopefully get it voted out to the House floor. So we ask a lot for folks to reach out to their representatives, and I did want to spend a little time this morning talking about how you do that, so that when we are asking folks like you that are advocates to reach out, you kind of know what to do. So the easiest way to figure out who represents you, if you go to any one of our State House websites, there are 3. There's one for the House, one for the Senate, and then one that's just Ohio Legislature. In any one of those 3 sites, you'll see a box very similar to what I've got on the bottom of the screen here that says who represents me, and it's got an opportunity for you to put your complete address in there. You'll click submit and it'll give you the folks that represent the district that you live in. So that's kind of step 1, is figuring out who to reach out to. So once you've done that, what are we asking for in terms of legislative advocacy? So that might look a little different depending on who represents you. The folks on the right here, those are folks that are co-sponsors along with Rep. Gambari and Skindle of House Bill 488. So if you live in one of these districts, the first thing I would do is thank these representatives or your representative for for supporting passenger rail. We've got a pretty diverse group here. We've got people from kind of all 5 major areas in the state, north, south, east, west, and central. We've got folks from both sides of the political spectrum. So this is a very bipartisan issue. And I think we've got, again, a very good chance to advocate here for passenger rail. If your rep is not on this list, we would certainly encourage you to reach out and ask them to support passenger rail expansion in general, and then specifically to support this bill, which would get us back in the MIPRC. So how would we advocate? So there's a couple of different ways you can reach out to your legislator's office. You can make a phone call. You will more than likely be speaking to their legislative aide, or you'll be asked to leave a message on a voicemail system. Certainly a great way to reach out and to certainly advocate. You can write a letter to your legislator and send it via snail mail. We would always recommend, or I would recommend, just in terms of public advocacy, that we keep the letter focused and brief. But it is, always good to include a personal story if it's, germane to the conversation. So if you've had a good experience with passenger rail, I know we do a lot of work with ability advocates where, rail transit is a much more reasonable method of transportation for a certain person. So that might be a good story to tell. Or just why passenger rail is specifically important to you or to your region of the state. And then finally, you can email your legislator. All the legislator office emails are listed on the website when you pull up who represents you. I would always recommend, if you do live in the district, to kind of lead with the fact that you're a constituent. These folks get hundreds of emails, phone calls, letters every single day. And the reality is they have to kind of prioritize things, and knowing that you are someone who could potentially vote or for or against them is always a good motivating factor to make sure that your comments bubble to the top. I always say be polite. It's I always like to ask in the positive and not really focus on negatives. If it's somebody that has been a supporter of passenger rail, certainly, again, thank them. Always ask for additional support and tell them why it's important to you. The other thing is to be timely. You can watch the legislative calendar on any of these websites to kind of figure out when there's going to be hearings in certain committees, when a bill might see the floor. But we're also going to try to do a better job, or a good job rather, of making sure that you folks that are All Aboard Ohio members and on our mailing list know when things are happening. So if House Bill 488, for example, will have a hearing in one of the committees, we want to make sure that so that that now is the time to kind of reach out to the folks that represent you. And that's really, kind of MIPRC in a nutshell, why it's important to us. And then also a little bit about legislative advocacy. I would certainly, offer, if there's anybody that wants additional information or maybe some guidance, or even just to have a set of eyes look over a letter or an email that you're planning on sending, I'm happy to do that. You can always reach out, John at All Aboard Ohio, JOHN, and I'm happy to do that for you. So with that, I'm going to turn things kind of back over to Brian to go over a little bit of an update on some of our corridor ID program, long distance rail program, and just some additional notes about passenger rail in Ohio.
Sure. Thanks, John. So as part of the infrastructure bill from a couple of years ago, there are 3 buckets of investment funding. So if you want to go ahead and click to the next slide there, John. Three buckets of investment funding, and one of those is the Northeast Corridor, so that doesn't really impact us at all. But when we look at, we've got the corridor ID program, and then we have the long distance rail study. And I think it's important to keep in mind that those are 2 different and distinct things. So essentially, what is the dividing line between those? Well, it's 750 miles. So anything that's less than 750 miles is going to be categorized as a state supported route, and that is what the corridor ID program is permanently funded on. So long distance rail is for routes over 750 miles. I think it's important to distinguish that the corridor ID has a more clear path towards execution, if you will. So there's more funding available, whereas the long distance rail study is really more of a aspirational view and what could potentially work, and setting the groundwork for development. But definitely more funding would be necessary to execute anything in the long distance rail study. So in the corridor ID program, when we talk about what are the impacts to Ohio, we have the 3C&D, so Cleveland, Columbus, Dayton, Cincinnati. Then separately, we have the Cleveland, Toledo, Detroit route. Those first two were sponsored by ORDC. Perhaps some of you have been watching, the statement of work was released by ORDC here in the last week or so. And that is what the consultants who actually execute the plans will use to build those. So those are now available in public. Then the next route that is being supported by MIPRC, the regional planning organization in Central Ohio, is a Chicago, Fort Wayne, Lima, Columbus, Pittsburgh route. And those of you who are more involved in the rail community know that that's going to be a bigger lift in terms of there is a lot more work that would need to be done to make that successful compared to the first two on this list. And then the other thing that came out of the corridor ID, Amtrak had submitted for some funding to support to work on trying to get the Cardinal up to daily service. So right now, the Cincinnati to Chicago train is a three times a week in each direction. So trying to increase that to daily service from Chicago through Cincinnati and then on to New York. So that was the other thing, and that really becomes a separate thing because Amtrak is the sponsor on that particular project. So those are the four things that came out of the corridor ID. So go ahead and cut to the next slide here, and we'll talk a little bit about the long distance. So these long distance rails, and again, this is a longer term study. They're talking about these things maybe happening in 2040 and probably would require a lot more financial support from Amtrak in the meantime. But there are two in there that have come through Ohio, and it's both pretty exciting things for the state. One would be the traditional Cincinnati to New Orleans train, and in this long distance rail study, they have extended that through the state of Ohio. So if you look at Cincinnati, Dayton, Columbus, and then going up to Toledo and on to Detroit to get that very large metropolitan area as a part of it. So that's a really interesting one for for the state as far as both getting to New Orleans, but also that it goes through Louisville and Nashville and those types of things. A lot of mutual benefit with the proposed 3C&D. So I think that this is a really interesting route that people are excited about. The other one that is proposed going through Ohio is a mostly an east-west route, but a New York following the Pennsylvanian through Philadelphia and Pittsburgh, and then coming through Ohio into Columbus to Dayton. Because because the rail tracks from Dayton to Indianapolis no longer exist, kind of taking a little turn down to Cincinnati and being able to pick up that metro area, but then on over to Indianapolis, St. Louis, and through Oklahoma to get to Dallas. So, it kind of an extension of what that traditional was. Now, there have been a number of discussions around these routes, and so a lot of you put in and submitted comments to the FRA after this last round, and that's wonderful. I'll be really interested to see when the next round of meetings on the long distance rail, what kind of an impact we were able to have. But there has been discussion, and there are some groups suggesting that perhaps well, maybe John, just go back. There are some groups suggesting that one on the left should take a route through Columbus to Cleveland to Toledo to Detroit. And there's a couple of shortcomings in my personal opinion. One, we as an organization want to have a direct connection from Toledo to Columbus. So that's an important thing. Two, there is very good rail infrastructure between Toledo and Columbus. So it's a good place to be building on and getting getting more rail and building the overall coalition of support for passenger rail. And then the other thing is we look at that line on the right, the route from Pittsburgh to Columbus is going to be more challenging, right? That's going to take a lot more investment to make happen. So now if we want to go ahead and flip to the next slide, one of the things I noticed as I was flipping through long distance rail studies on all of these routes, they evaluated a number of different routings. And so if we were looking at this particular route, there's a much stronger case to be made. If we're going to suggest a slightly different route on one of these, that perhaps this is the route that we should be focused on, with the old national service, because going from Pittsburgh to Cleveland to Columbus is surprisingly not as much out of the way as one would expect. And then the big thing here is that the kind of the triangle that goes up to Cleveland, that is on much better existing routes. So, as we continue to look at the long distance rail study, and continuing to put input in on this, this could perhaps be a place to look. The most important part of all of this is that these long distance rail studies on the previous slide and this one are much longer term type of projects. These are types of things where they're saying, hey, let's try and get this done by 2040. There's going to have to be new investments from Congress going into these, and these proposals would take a lot more money to execute. So as we think about what's been proposed, the corridor ID are more of a medium term type of project, whereas the long distance rail is definitely long term types of project. So anyway, just wanted to talk about that a little bit and kind of get that message out, and make sure that we're understanding what some of the implications are of these things. The corridor ID things, Ohio 3C and D, the Cleveland, Columbus, Detroit, those are much more straightforward projects than these long distance rail, and with at least as of today, a more clear funding path to getting there. So those were some of the comments that I just wanted to make on the long distance rail study. And then I think the thing that gives us is a good amount of time to have, an open Q&A. So if you've got, questions that you've been thinking about and considering, or, now with the formal announcement of John as our new executive director, if there's other questions for John, those would be great. Our board president, Mitch, is also on the call today. So we're all here and available to have any discussion, any other topics that you wanted to bring up here. Been watching, the chat's been a little quiet on today's call, but Mitch, did you want to say something? Yeah, go ahead.
Well, I mean, I can kick us off. I have a question that I think kind of fits into this discussion, and I'm assuming John will have an answer. So we've talked MIPRC today. Another Midwest related thing that we hear about is Amtrak Midwest. Where does that fit into this?
So very similar to MIPRC. Any table that we can have a seat at here in Ohio and really advocate for daylight service in Ohio, I think is going to be critical for this expansion. And again, just to reiterate the point, I am so worried that we'll have such good state-sponsored rail, and we'll be able to connect all these cities throughout Ohio. But then if we want to make that next step to the rest of the Amtrak network, that we're going to be kind of crippled by the timing that these long distance trains come through the state. So, Amtrak Midwest, very similar to the MIPRC as a, kind of an overarching planning organization or planning body. It's just so critical that we have a seat at that table, and we're able to have conversations with our peers in other states. Good question.
Go ahead with yours, Paul, and then I'll get the one in the chat.
Yeah, hi. Unless it's changed in the last few years, my understanding is that the panhandle between Columbus and Mingo Junction is owned by the state of Ohio, and the G&W Ohio Central is the designated operator. Is that still true or not?
That is correct. Basically from the city of Columbus east till just outside the city of Steubenville is exactly what you said, owned by the state, operated by, at this point, they've changed the nomenclature. It's the Columbus and Ohio River Railroad is the operating partner, but it is a Genesee, Wyoming property. So I think that kind of gives us a unique opportunity, at least for that chunk of the Midwest Connect, where very similar to states like Michigan and Virginia and North Carolina, we've got state ownership. So we're really investing in our own assets to bring them up to speed.
That was my point. It's not exactly a high density use line at the moment, as near as I know.
Correct. Yeah, it doesn't get a whole lot of traffic on the freight side, although not really publicly discussed at this point, but the Columbus and Ohio River Railroad did meet the threshold late last year to become a Class 2 railroad. So we now have them in the Wheeling Lake area in the state of Ohio. So they are kind of the next rung up on the ladder.
Gould Tunnel would be an issue, but I mean, it's like 100 years old and needs some work.
Let's see, John, there was a good question in the chat. Somebody writing in curious about the potential timeline for increasing frequency of service on the Cardinal line. So just, with Amtrak submitting to corridor ID, what might potentially happen?
Absolutely. So very similar to the answer that I would give on any of these corridor ID timelines is at this point, we really don't know. We are at the very beginning of the process on all 4 of Ohio's corridors. I would say that, obviously the lift on daily Cardinal service is a lot lighter than the rest of them. We just need to make sure we've got equipment and, rail crews to handle the additional service. We don't really need to upgrade a whole lot of infrastructure like we do with these other ones. So presumably it will happen with a faster timeline. The other caveat to the Cardinal service is because there isn't a body in Ohio that is responsible for it, we're kind of out of the loop on how that's happening. Amtrak has really taken the lead on that, so it's kind of up to them to work their way through the 3 steps of the process.
Let's see. I think kind of in the maybe in a similar vein, one of the things that we've learned here in the last few weeks is that Amtrak in their budget request requested $25 million for improvements along the Lakeshore line, separate from Chicago requests. So as part of their Great Lakes initiative, they have requested $25 million. Now, I think an important note is that is the budget that has not yet been funded, but it does reflect an Amtrak, recognition of the importance of improving things in the Midwest, and that $25 million request for this year is part of a $300 million request over the course of 5 years. So we were excited to see that and appreciative of Amtrak's efforts to include that in their budgeting priorities.
Yeah, if I may add, this is something I think that we all have to go out and support wholeheartedly. It's the first time that I can recall in all the years I've been involved with this stuff that Amtrak has proactively done anything along these lines. And so it's up to us to generate the support. I've had a discussion with Derek James, and he's looking for our support on this. So I think it's critically important. It'll also help the Cleveland, Toledo, Detroit initiative. So it really is something that is long overdue, and it's a sign of an Amtrak that's more proactive in our part of the country than it has been. So I think we need to support that. We need to thank Amtrak for that. But we more importantly need to go to Congress and make sure that they know that this is an important item to us. And so the other item that I did want to chat about was the FRA long distance study, and it is at the direction of Congress. It only studies new routes. It doesn't talk about added service on existing routes, and I think this is a key miss on the part of Congress. And I think that we need to speak up about that because there are some things that could be done on an interim basis. And I don't want to get into them here, but we all know there's been a lot of discussion over the years about that kind of thing. And I think that again, this is another thing that we need to speak up about. 2 members of Congress, and particularly maybe Sherrod Brown, who I think should be an ally in this. Plainly, service during the middle of the night is not what we should be advocating for. Obviously, there should be a call for service during marketable hours along all points of the Lakeshore route and other long distance routes. So my 2 cents.
Thanks, Bill. Yeah, go ahead, Merlin.
I just wanted to bring up a little snag in the 3-day-a-week schedule now for when we're talking about reasons to go from Cincinnati to Chicago, and then to get to like Texas, Arizona, LA, the southern route. The Texas Eagle Sunset Limited also only goes 3 days a week, but they're not the same 3 days a week. So you have to go on the Cardinal. It gets there at 10 o'clock in the morning. You have to stay overnight in Chicago to get a 2 o'clock train roughly the next day to go west. It would be doable if they were on the same 3-day schedule, but they're not. So.
Yep, absolutely. That's a good point. And the gaps of the gaps of scheduling not having sufficient frequency.
Mhm.
Yeah, and in that vein, All Aboard Erie and the Lakeshore Rail Alliance are going to sponsor a meeting on June 13th in Erie, and all are invited. But the interesting thing is that Derek James is going to appear, but he's going to be coming from, I think, Champaign, Illinois, or someplace like that. And that means that he gets to Erie at about 6:37 in the morning and has to loll around until 1 p.m. when the meeting starts. And then after the meeting is over, he's got 12 hours to get the westbound Lakeshore out of Erie at about 2:30 in the morning. Not conducive.
Any other questions for John or for any of us as we're kind of talking through?
Yeah, I've got one more, John. Could you touch on how much effort does it take for a representative to have their name on that sponsors list? Like, should our goal in the future, or I'm thinking, like, I didn't see my representative on that list. Is it something as simple as raising your hand and like just like knowing about it, or is there actual work that they had to put in to get their name on the list?
So typically what happens is a bill will be introduced kind of on the back end by the two sponsors or one sponsor, in this case, Gambari and Skindle, and they'll send out kind of an open call for co-sponsors. So in some cases, it can just be if you live in a district that has a normally rail friendly representative, it could just be that it wasn't necessarily flagged in a way that they saw it, because again, these folks get just so many hundreds of communications a day. In some cases, we're able to do some advocacy when we know that there's a call for sponsors going out, that we can really reach out and say, hey, at that point, it wouldn't have a bill number, but there's language being floated around to rejoin MIPRC. This is why it's important. We'd like to see you as a co-sponsor. It's also something that they can add their names to later. And there are some folks in our legislature that like to see kind of how a bill plays out throughout committee, just to make sure that nothing changes dramatically in terms of amendments or in terms of the language as it plays its way through the committee process before they go on as a co-sponsor. So it's not necessarily indicative of not supporting the bill. But we can certainly advocate again. If you see a legislator that represents you that is not part of that or not a co-sponsor, you can ask them to become one.
Great. Thanks, John.
And I'm not sure, Sue, if I fully understand your question. The comment that I had made about ORDC is that the statement of work specifically to the 3C&D and the Cleveland, Toledo, Detroit was made public by ORDC sometime in the last 2 weeks. And so that's the document that explains to the consultants of the world, like the AECOMs and other similar organizations of the world that actually put together the plan. So it's essentially a document defining the next step. So I think that the news there wasn't really anything new in there, but it does indicate, progress and continuing to move through the process. And it's essentially the next step in the corridor ID program overall. So I think that's what your question was there.
So what I know of as request for proposal, they call statement of work.
Well, I'm not. Yeah, I guess I don't know that. Perhaps John knows from a terminology standpoint. But in my head, I was interpreting that as somewhat similar to a request for proposal, but I don't know if there are other nuances between that terminology.
Yeah, I don't believe the formal request for proposal has gone out yet, Sue. And I guess maybe just as a matter of information for everybody on the call, ORDC does have their bi-monthly meeting this Thursday at 11 a.m. Here in Columbus. You can watch it virtually, of course. And I think the presumption that I've heard from our friends at MIPRC is that after that meeting, the formal RFP will go out. I think the statement of work is kind of, to Brian's point, the crafting the request in such a way that people know what they're asking for. I hope that answers that question.
Yeah, and a lot of the details were straight from the FRA part. Go ahead, Sue.
So John, have you read through what they wrote?
I haven't read through the most recent document. I mean, I've studied the initial statement of work, which is what was submitted to FRA early on in terms of being considered for the corridor ID program. I'd be surprised if anything changed between those two documents.
Are you happy with how they worded things?
Yeah, I don't know that happy is, a word that I would use, but I mean, I also don't know how much it matters at the end of the day, because I think a lot of the real work about how this is going to work in terms of an operational passenger route is going to come from later steps in the process.
I mean, I started reading it and realized it was all what we had read before. So at that point I changed to skim mode, and I didn't see anything that stuck out one way or the other. I was kind of hoping for something that might be, ooh, that's interesting. And it was essentially what was, already discussed in previous things. And I kind of, in my conversations with Bill, it seemed like that was also his impression of like, hey, I started reading and it didn't really seem any different. So then I went, going into skimming it. But like at least in that level of review, I didn't see anything that like jumped out either as like super positive or new or interesting or negative. It was just fine. It was like, hey, good, the next step has happened. That's a reassuring sign. At least we know it's kind of moving through the process.
Yeah, the only thing that I saw were there were two maps, one for the 3CD and the other one for Cleveland, Toledo, Detroit. And it was kind of interesting that the area that they were talking about studying also, covered like a variation to Toledo, from Toledo to Detroit by way of the airport, Detroit Metro, and also between Columbus and Northern Ohio kind of widened out a little bit. And I think that's to look at the NS line up to Bellevue and over to Cleveland from there. So that's really all that was in there that was noteworthy. It's a lot of dry techno stuff for the consultants to look at. Just what the roadmap is for them to do the study. That's really all it is. There's really nothing else there.
Good.
Yeah, Michael Connor and I were behind having the trains overnight in Painesville.
Well, so, I mean, one of the things I think is that if we're able to get more service on existing routes, it becomes easier to convince communities along those routes to be asking for stations. Right now, if you've only got a train going through one time at night, it's kind of tough to make especially in the middle of the night, it's tough to make the argument to the community to make any additional investment there. But if we're able to get some traction, one of the things that that Bill has continued to push Amtrak on is like, hey, let's just instead of splitting the Lakeshore train in Albany, let's just make it 2 different trains with 2 different schedules to improve the times that it could serve the area. And that, that kind of proposal makes it easier to account for equipment things and things like that. So I think those are the types of incremental steps that we want to be pushing for and advocating for, even in a more near term compared to corridor ID. I don't know, Paul, did you want to add something there?
Well, it not exactly on the same thing, but
Oh, sure, go ahead.
I had heard that Amtrak may be planning to end the Silver Star at Washington and combine the equipment pool with the Capital Limited and make it single level again. Have you heard anything about that?
I have. If you look at the Amtrak reservation system, let's say you're going to buy a coach ticket, you want to go from Jacksonville to New York City, it won't let you do that after September 5th. It just says sold out. So there's been a lot of speculation about that. And the rationale behind it is to reassign the superliners that are on the Capital Limited to trains out west because they have a chronic equipment shortage. And then there's 3 sets of equipment dedicated to the Capital. And they figure that if they go directly to Chicago from Washington instead of New York, they only need 1 more set of Viewliners and Amfleet 2s for that train. I don't know if it's really going to happen or not, but it sure seems likely.
Okay.
Yeah. And as long as we're talking about Amtrak national news, there is another piece of exciting news. You got new Amtrak service starting here in the next 2 weeks. Chicago, Milwaukee to St. Paul, Minnesota, a newly established, they're calling it the Borealis, which I guess is what we got to witness last night, is pretty fitting. But anyway, so it essentially adds additional, an additional train between Milwaukee and St. Paul every day. So it is essentially, it's replacing one of the Hiawatha. So there's no more frequency between Milwaukee and Chicago, but there's already quite a bit there. But yeah, so if you think about what the Empire Builder does of Chicago, Milwaukee, St. Paul, and then going west through Montana to Seattle, the route that is just Chicago, Milwaukee, St. Paul is now going to have a second train every day in both directions. So great news for them, great news for both Minnesota and Wisconsin. And it's nice to see some expansion of Amtrak service here coming up. So good. Well, I think with that, we've gotten a chance to answer all of at least all the questions that I got a chance to see there. So it was very good to see everybody. For those of you in Northeast Ohio, I hope I get to see you in Akron Wednesday evening. Look forward to seeing you. Everybody that might be interested in the Cuyahoga Valley Scenic Railroad, please do sign up for that June session, and I'll look forward to seeing you that as well. And then for everybody on the call, please do add the state meeting in July to your calendar. We look forward to seeing you there in person. Have a great rest of your weekend.
Thank you.
Thanks, y'all. Bye-bye.